Well, as we get started tonight, I want us to, we'll answer some questions on Hebrews in a minute here. But as we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about next year. We are wrapping up the New Testament in a year, and put a lot of thought and prayer into what do we do next year. This time in McCook, I was actually preparing to resign, so I didn't get to follow up the New Testament in the year in McCook. I decided not to resign here this year. I decided to stick around for a little while longer. Kind of what we're looking at, I talked to the board this week and got their approval to do this. But I think what we're going to try to do is start in January. We're going to go to the Old Testament with Genesis, Exodus, and Joshua. So it'll be about the same amount of reading, about a chapter a day, that we'll read in January, February, March. In April, we'll go back to the New Testament, and we're going to look at things from the perspective of Peter. So we're going to go with the Gospel of Mark, which was the gospel that Peter narrated to Mark. We'll look at the first 10 chapters of Acts, and then we'll do 1st and 2nd Peter, which we'll do in a couple weeks here, but kind of come back to those. The third quarter, starting in July, we'll go back to the Old Testament. We'll pick up the story with Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel. So we'll kind of look at that era of the Old Testament. And then in October, we'll come back to the New Testament with Luke, Acts, and Romans. So we're going to look at the life of Paul again. And then the next year, we'll figure out what we're going to do. We'll pick up some more in the Old Testament. A part of what I like about this style, first of all, as a pastor, it keeps me moving. It's easy for pastors to get stuck, and I can camp out in a passage and stay there. You guys have, I don't know, I spent months in the first few chapters of Acts, spent months in John 15. This keeps me moving and makes sure that we're covering a good amount of material, but it also makes sure that we're regularly reading together. And I think there's a definite benefit and an accountability to us reading when we're reading together, versus just leaving you to say, read whatever you want to. So we're looking for a more balanced approach next year. And I'm excited about getting into the Old Testament. I've not done these kind of classes on the Old Testament before, so I have a lot to learn. I have a lot of studying to do, so that'll be kind of nice. But still keeping a balanced approach where we're touching on the big themes of the Old Testament and the storyline, and then we'll come back to the New Testament and look at that again as well. So hopefully you'll enjoy that. We'll continue with the handouts, with the emails, the text messages, continue with that line of thinking, so we can basically do the same thing, but look at the Old Testament, more balanced approach as well. Any questions on that or any thoughts on that? All right. Now, the book of Hebrews, I told you last week, is just a flat-out difficult book. Have you found that to be the case? There's a lot in there that's confusing, and that's okay. We're okay with being confused. But there's a lot in there that is kind of summed up in chapter 5 and 6. And I alluded to this morning. This is the message that I was planning to preach this week and didn't. Chapter 5, starting with verse 11. There is much more that we would like to say about this, but it is difficult to explain, especially since you are spiritually dull and don't seem to listen. Don't you love that? You have been believers so long now that you ought to be teaching others. Instead, you need someone to teach you again the basic things about God's Word. You are like babies who need milk and cannot eat solid food. For someone who lives on milk is still an infant and doesn't know how to do what is right. Solid food is for those who are mature, who through training have the skill to recognize the difference between right and wrong. So let us stop going over the basic teachings about Christ again and again. Let us go on instead and become mature in our understanding. Surely we don't need to start again with the fundamental importance of repenting from evil deeds and placing our faith in God. You don't need further instructions about baptisms, the laying on of hands, the resurrection of dead, and the eternal judgment. And so, God willing, we will move forward to further understanding. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of sounds harsh. And it's harsh to a population who is going through some pretty difficult times. But I think one of the things that this points out is that there is an expectation for us to be growing in our faith. There's a journey that we're to be on. And one of the reasons that we're doing what we're doing, going through the New Testament in a year and next year with our biblical approach, is we want to make sure that we are not just spending all of our time on the basics, which is another thing that pastors like to do. We have so simplified the gospel within the church. We want it packageable, we want it sellable, we want to be able to present it in 5 minutes or less. We have so packaged things, so simplified things, that we don't teach people the full scope of what God's Word says, and so we have to keep going over the basics because we didn't really explain it right the first time. We just kind of touched on the talking points. So this is he launches from this into the discussion about Melchizedek, about Christ being the high priest, about the Old Testament tabernacle and how that's not the real thing. It's just a reflection of the tabernacle in heaven. There's a whole lot in that we look at it and we say, wow, how does he have time to think about all these things? But there's a definite difference in the time that they were spending studying the Scriptures and the level of questioning that they were coming up with based on the time that they were spending studying Scriptures that should leave us feeling, we really need to spend more time with God's Word. But there are good things ahead if we stick with it. We just want to make sure that we're sticking with it as a church. Does that make sense? Any questions on what we read last week in Hebrews? No questions? Thought surely we'd have a couple on Melchizedek. All right.
Well, what are the answers then?
Remember with Melchizedek, he's telling this to prove a point. The point that the author is trying to prove is that Jesus can indeed be the high priest even though he was not from the line of Levi. Yeah. So that's the point that he's trying to prove. Now he's like another pastor I know who takes the long way around to answer the question. Right, Jack? He takes the long way to get there. But that's the point that he's trying to prove. Now, again, I believe that this is not necessarily a letter that was written as much as a sermon that was given. Chapter 13 was written to kind of summarize and to make it into a letter. But everything else from the beginning, there is no introduction in this letter, you remember. It just jumps right in. I think that this was actually a sermon that was preached, and then somebody transcribed it, wrote it down as it was being preached, and then at the end they said, well, let's write a summary chapter or a summary section and send it out as a letter, because this is one of those sermons that everybody needs to hear. And so that's probably why it doesn't talk, it doesn't give an introduction, it doesn't say who it's to, it just starts right in. Now at the end, chapter 13, when we get to chapter 13, it will look more like a letter. That chapter reads like a letter, but nothing else does. It kind of sounds like a preacher who's chasing rabbits a couple of times. Any other questions?
Melchizedek, he was actually a forerunner of Christ. I mean, I've read some reading that some people thought he was like an angel or something, but he was an actual person.
He was an actual person, and a part of the reason that some people think he's an angel is because it says that he's without beginning and without an end. We just don't know. And so the author, he kind of made a play on that, the fact that we don't know where this guy came from. All we know is that he shows up as a high priest of God, and Genesis clarifies that, and that Abraham offered sacrifices to him. So he had no beginning, he had no ending in what we read, but he was a man. He was definitely a man. And as far as a forerunner to Christ, he was definitely a high priest. And to say any more than that, I think we just don't know enough. We know that he was a high priest. We know he was a priest in the city of Salem, which later became known as Jerusalem. Interesting correlation there. And where was Jesus crucified? Jerusalem. So that's why there's this comparison. But we don't know enough to say whether he was a forerunner to Christ, or we don't know anything about him other than he shows up, Abraham gives him tribute, and he goes on. Any other questions or thoughts? This week we get to read what I think is some of the best reading in Hebrews, and that is Hebrews chapter 11. The great examples of faith. These chapters are going to encourage us as we read about those who have gone before, and yet it's going to remind us several times in chapter 11, verse 13, all these people died still believing what God had promised them, but they did not receive what was promised. But they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. Now that's a pretty substantial statement. We live in a culture where we believe that things get done. Very few things in our culture do not get done in our lifetime. We don't start projects that we don't think we can finish, for the most part. The culture that they lived in, there were a whole lot of projects that one generation would start, another generation would work on, another generation would work on. You remember how long it took to build the temples of that day?
You were saying 50 years somebody would work on those things. Those
just one column
yeah.
would be 59 years worth of labor just for one column, I think. The temple itself, the temple to Apollo, for example, took over 400 years to complete. Now, we don't know how to comprehend that. Well, they started the project here and then it was finished 400 years later. I mean, we think that we feel that way about the 74 bridge, but the truth is the 74 bridge isn't that old. In this comparison, Bill Reasoner's grandfather helped build the first of the 74 bridge. That's an interesting story he can tell you sometime. And they let him keep all the scraps of wood if he would clean it up. So the house that Bill lives in was built from the scraps of the I-74 bridge. He said there's not a truss or a board in that house that's over 8 foot long. But it's anyway, that's a project that we think is taking forever to try to get the tax money together to approve this project. But it really isn't taking that long. I can remember living in Colorado Springs, and when we lived in Colorado Springs, they had started working on I-25 before we got there. And they said it would be finished in 2012. And I can remember thinking, my goodness, that's forever. Now, I haven't been out there since this year to see if they actually finished it. I need to ask Derek and Renee and see, did they ever finish I-25? Chances are they probably started other projects on I-25 because the city continued to grow. But for us, that's forever to take 10 to 15 years on a project. And yet in this culture, they would start a project and it would take 400 years to finish it. The temple in Jerusalem. Herod the Great started that temple, I think it was around 33 BC. They were still working on it in Jesus' time, and it actually was finished in the early 60s, about 10 years before it was torn down.
I imagine they'd have to haul that material from a long ways, right? I mean, there would be nothing there.
They would have to haul it?
And they didn't have no help, probably.
Well, they had slave labor.
Well, I mean, no help to haul it.
They didn't have any
trucks. They didn't have nothing.
No trucks, no trains.
Drag it or carry it.
No cranes.
No.
Think about the work that was involved in that. So for them, this statement in Hebrews chapter 11:13, all these people died still believing what God had promised them. They did not receive what was promised, but they saw it all from a distance and welcomed it. That made sense to them. For us, we struggle with that. We need to see things done in our lifetimes. And I pointed out last week, verse 39 as well. All these people earned a good reputation because of their faith, yet none of them received all that God had promised. For God had something better in mind for us, so that they would not reach perfection without us. That statement is one that just kind of haunts me. What the author is saying there is that all of the work that was put into to following God, Abraham's following God, Noah's following God, all of their obedience was not complete in and of itself. It becomes complete as we and the generations that follow us all put together what the story of God is. That means that what they did was not complete in and of itself. They did what they did so that we could do what we need to do, so that the generations after us can do what we need to do. And in the end, the story will all make sense. But we're a part of this. That means that we've got a significant responsibility. And it's not acceptable for us just to pass it off and say, oh, we went to church and did our thing. We're a part of something much bigger. So as you read this week, and as you read, especially you read these stories, because these stories of faith are stories that will bring back a lot of memories for us of hearing these stories and learning these stories. But keep that in mind, that these stories are not completed by themselves. They're completed in us and the generations that will follow us. All right. James. When we look at the book of Hebrews, Hebrews is very theoretical, very philosophical. It's talking about stuff that's over our heads at times. James is quite the opposite. James is going to tell you what to do 50 times in 108 verses. He's going to give an imperative statement of do this. James is extremely practical. When we look at Hebrews, and Hebrews is saying don't keep going over these basics, James is the, I started to say the Bobby Knight of the Bible, the focus on the basics. Get the fundamentals right.
He didn't tame his tongue, though.
No, he did not tame his tongue. Or anything else. But the concept of get the fundamentals right. This is what James is going to teach us. Bobby Knight is a really bad example to use in a sermon for anything.
James didn't throw no chairs.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to leave Bobby Knight alone. When we look at an epistle, we ask the questions: who is the author? Who is the audience? What is the historical context of the letter? Why was it written? And when was it written? And what are the major themes and the theological truths that we draw from the letter? When we start with the question of who is the author. Now the book it starts out with a name. This letter is from James, a slave of God and the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, it's kind of like somebody saying this letter is from James today. You guys know any James? You guys named James? How many do you know? A lot? Quite a few? It's like in our church saying this letter was written by Bob. This one, or this one?
The good guys.
They all went together.
They all went together.
They collaborated.
When we look at the New Testament, James is one of the common names. We see this quite a few times. We see James, the brother of John, who was a prominent apostle. Peter, James, and John in a sailboat. You remember that James? Of course, he was the first martyr in the New Testament, so it couldn't have been him. He was probably dead before that happened. James the Less, or James the Younger, we see referenced several times in Scripture. We don't know a lot about him, but we know that there is a James the Less. James the father of Judas, possibly Thaddeus. Their names got confusing. Then we see James the Lord's brother. He shows up in Matthew and Mark. He is the most likely candidate to be the author of this letter. He was the James who went on to be the leader of the church in Jerusalem. In Acts chapter 15, we see that Paul and Barnabas come to Jerusalem, and they have some things to get settled, and they take it to Peter and James. And we see that the letter to the Galatians, which was Paul's fiery letter, the people claimed to be sent by James, but they weren't really. This is the James. There's another James called James the son of Alphaeus. He's mentioned 4 times, but we don't know enough about him. James the Just, or James the Camel-Kneed. They called James the Just was definitely a man of prayer. And they said that his knees were calloused from the countless hours that he spent in prayer. And they said that in his home there were grooves worn in the floor where he would kneel every day to pray. Now that tells us a little bit about who this guy is. He was definitely someone who was intimate with his brother. He was the brother of Jesus. Mary had several children. We don't know all of their names. James was one. Jesus' brothers and his mother came when Jesus was teaching. They thought he was insane. And they came to get him, to take him back home. Now, think about that for a moment. Jesus' mother and brothers thought he was insane. Do you remember the story of Jesus' birth that's told in Luke? As a mother, she had experienced becoming pregnant without ever being with a man. Never happened before and hasn't happened since. And yet, this miraculous child she thought was insane. And her sons, other sons, probably had a lot to do with that. Mom, can't you tell? Can't you see? If he was truly the Messiah, he would be taking care of the political business that the Jews need taken care of. If he were truly the Messiah, he wouldn't go around hanging out with all these lowlifes. He would be hanging around with the people that could get stuff done. James thought his brother was crazy. Imagine what life must have been like for James coming up to this point. How many of you were ever compared to older siblings when you were growing up? Why can't you be more like... Imagine what this is like for James. Why can't you be more like Jesus? Because he's perfect. All the teachers, why can't you listen like Jesus? Why can't you teach us like Jesus? And James, we don't know exactly what happened. He went somehow from thinking that his brother was crazy. We know that, and Paul tells us in the letter to the Corinthians, that in the 40 days between Jesus' resurrection and his ascension that he met with James. He met with his brothers. And that conversation completely changed James' life. And so he dedicated his life to the mission of his crazy brother. And so he carried that mission on, becoming a leader of the church in Jerusalem.
Well, from the time that Jesus was born, we don't really hear, am I wrong or right? You don't hear of anything about Jesus during so many years.
We only hear...
more or less, wasn't it just when John baptized him, when he came, was that the first time that we hear, and that's
Luke tells us that he went to the temple when he was 12.
Yes.
So we see that little story
we
where
see that, but nothing as a man.
There's not a lot told. And that's because of the way that biographies were written in that time period. Now, when we pick up a biography today, we expect to find out all the details. In that day, if you picked up a biography, which the Gospels were written to be, you're going to find out a lot about that person's teaching. But not the details of their life, because nobody cared about that then. Now, we care about it. We wish that we had, and actually there's several books that started circulating about 100 or so years after Jesus' life that supposedly told the stories, but they were not viewed to be canonical. They are in the Apocrypha. Some of them are, but there's a whole lot more. We don't know a lot about Jesus' life, but we can tell from the story that we do see of him going to the temple that this wasn't his godness, didn't just show up when he was 12 years old, or when he was 33 years old and in his ministry. This is the way that he had been even as a child, and Luke included that story from when he was 12 years old, so that we would know that he was born miraculously. He had the gift and the intelligence to where he could go into the temple where all the wise guys sat. They had special rooms set up in the temple for the teachers. And he would sit as a 12-year-old in the temple and taught them a thing or two. Now, so we know that it wasn't just that the godness showed up when he was 30. As some people have suggested that he was just a normal kid until the time he was 30 when he was baptized and something happened.
No, I never lived that because even when he was in Temple, he said he was to his parents when they were hunting him. He was about his father's business.
Right. Didn't you know that I would be in my Father's house? That's
So
kind of an
therefore,
assumption.
we know, but I just want it's long from the time actually when John was baptizing. Then they kind of thought that he might have been because he says there's one that's coming greater than I.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
they
that's
asked John
when-
if he was
and
Messiah.
then that's when Jesus appeared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we basically don't know much
Yeah.
about Jesus' life up until this point.
Well, sometimes better to don't know a lot about people's lives, I guess, before because in our days, if you know too much about somebody, it's either false or true, and only that one person knows.
Yeah, there's a whole lot of stuff that'll spin around.
So maybe that's the reason it's not here.
Yeah. As we look at James, some of the question about James' authorship is that now Hebrews has the best Greek in the New Testament, but James is actually pretty good Greek. We don't know much about James other than we don't see anywhere that he ever left Palestine. And so some people have questioned, well, how could James, the brother of Jesus, who was raised where? In Nazareth, in a small hick town, how could he learn this good of Greek? Part of that is answerable, and I'll get to that. It's also interesting that the author never calls himself Jesus' brother. And you would think, if it's Jesus' brother, that you would say, I'm Jesus' brother. Unless he was writing to an audience who absolutely knew who he was and he didn't need to introduce himself. I was watching a video last night from Chuck Swindoll. And Chuck Swindoll is the chancellor of Dallas Theological Seminary. And this is one of the videos from the Dallas Theological Seminary's chapel. And the gentleman who stood up to introduce him basically said, I'm going to introduce someone that I don't need to introduce to you. You all know who he is. And I'm sitting there thinking, yeah, I know who Chuck Swindoll is, but who in the world are you? Because the video doesn't introduce him. It just is. But when you have somebody like James, there's no need to introduce yourself. You're James. And everybody knows who that is. So even though he never calls himself Jesus' brother, when he says James and says the things that he says, he's got some authority to say what he says. So that makes sense. We can look at a couple of these things and think that maybe the author is interacting with Pauline theology, which came after some believe that James the Just died. But what we see going back and forth between James and Paul is not so much that they truly disagreed with one another, but they disagreed with the implications, the unexplained implications of what the other was saying. Paul says a lot about the fact that we are saved by faith. Now, when we are saved by faith, we believe that. But we don't believe that being saved by faith means that all you do is accept that salvation and go on with your life as if nothing happened. And there's some who took what Paul said and said, oh, well, I'm saved by faith. I don't have to live anything. I don't have to do anything because I'm saved by faith. And James is writing to say, you're crazy if you think that's what my brother died for. Mm-hmm. We don't believe in a message of salvation that says you are saved by faith so you can live however you want to. That's not the message of the New Testament. If you haven't picked up on that yet, it's not in there. What we believe is that salvation is a free gift. We are saved by faith, accepting that gift by faith. But accepting that gift by faith means that we now live a different life than what we lived before. We don't earn our salvation. But you cannot have a relationship with someone and act like you don't. Which is what James is going to write to address.
Actually, it would be like a marriage. You can't be unfaithful and still have a good marriage.
Right. As our politicians are finding out this week, right? the marriage example is a good one. It takes a balance in marriage of the faith, but also of the works. And some people from James, or they said they were from James, they weren't actually, came and said, well, you have to earn your salvation. You have to do all the right things in order to earn your salvation, circumcision. And Paul is saying, absolutely not. So we see these two, it's not that they're going at each other, it's that the incorrect application of what they're saying is conflicting. It is a balance of the works and the faith. It is not either one to the extreme. And so we see those two interacting. The Greek in this, as far as it being too good of a Greek, the Greek was likely written by a secretary. James, we definitely know knew Greek because in Acts chapter 15, when he issues the edict of this is what we expect people to follow, he writes that in Greek. So we know that James knew Greek, but very few of the letters of the New Testament were actually written by the authors. Most of them were written by secretaries. We see in Paul's letters where it says, see what large letters or large writing I use when I write this with my own hand. We know that Paul used a secretary. In Romans, the secretary is named Tertius. I, Tertius, who am writing this letter for Paul, send my greetings also. So we recognize that secretaries were used, and that can very easily make up the difference in polished Greek versus unpolished Greek. With an early writing of Galatians, he could have been interacting with Paul, but it's also possible that he's dealing with the issues that come up with his own church or own churches. He doesn't have to be arguing with Paul here. You certainly could see that, but it doesn't have to be that way. The early church tradition, Josephus and Eusebius, all show James the Just as the author of this book. And when we're trying to put the author in place, we weren't there, we don't know, so we refer to the people who were there. And Josephus was alive at this time, and so if he attributes this to James, the brother of Jesus, there's probably a pretty good chance that that's where it came from. So that solves the authorship question, but now the question is, who is the audience? I'm writing to the 12 tribes, Jewish believers scattered abroad. That's a pretty big audience, isn't it? James has become the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and you remember that after the persecution in Acts chapter 6, when Paul went on his rampage, the Christians all left, but the disciples all stayed. Now eventually we see that the other disciples will travel out. We don't see that James ever leaves Jerusalem. We see that Peter ends up all over the place, not quite as much as Paul, but he follows in Paul's footsteps. But James basically stays put in Jerusalem. So it's him writing this letter from there to everybody scattered abroad. We don't know much about the reason for the letter, which leads us to the question of, maybe it's not an actual letter, but maybe it's a best of collection. Anybody have a best of collection in their music library? The best hits of. I was looking at some discs that Carl Jones had. The best of the Gaither Trio. The best of collections. Pretty popular sellers because you know every album has like 3 songs you like and 10 that you don't. So just collects those good ones. It's possible that this book is actually a collection of James' best of sayings. We don't know for sure. If it is a letter, it appears that trouble has broken out in the churches, and James is writing to address it, and this trouble is just a birdshot approach. I mean, whatever is going on, it's just all over the board. What we see here in this letter is just, you're here, you're here, you're here, you're here. It's a shotgun approach. It's just all over the board, the things that are being addressed, which in my mind helps me. I like the best of approach better than a regular letter because it just doesn't read like a letter. It reads like a best of approach. But I could be wrong. I've
My
been wrong
Bible
before.
says that he was there because the people has kind of lost their faith. And he was there to try to encourage them in their faith. And you know, that is a good possibility because when you start losing your faith, you're going to have trouble.
And one challenge with that is that Jesus' name is mentioned in the introduction, but not again.
How's that?
when we're talking about, it's not like the letters of Paul talk about the relationship with Jesus Christ. And the Hebrew letter talks about the work of Jesus Christ. This one doesn't address, I mean, it talks about Jesus in the introduction, but I don't think he mentions Jesus' name.
No, I said James.
Right.
Was there to encourage.
Right, and he's definitely, whether it's a best of collection or whether it is an actual letter, he's definitely trying to rein people in and address a whole lot of issues, a whole lot of challenges that are going on in the church. There are multiple areas of sin that are addressed in this letter. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that he's going to touch on.
Verse 26 is a good one, chapter 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's just so much in this letter. My King James, well, actually in this one too, the King James Bible I used in high school, the whole thing was highlighted. And this one, I think there's only about 3 or 4 verses that aren't highlighted throughout this, because there's so many snippets that are powerful. And what he has to say about the tongue, which he says there, and then he comes back to again in chapter 3, that's some pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah.
Very powerful stuff. To offer wisdom to be applied to the lives of the church. How many of you enjoy reading the book of Proverbs? Proverbs is a good read. Some good statements to keep you focused on what wisdom is. Some people believe that this is the Proverbs of the New Testament. So it's just those imperative statements to keep you focused. The author is clearly disgusted in this letter by a faith that is being proclaimed without works to back it up. He's not saying you earn your salvation, but he's disgusted by people who would say that all you have to do is say a prayer and you're there. What is being preached in a lot of our churches today would absolutely drive him nuts. Christianity, there's no Happy Meal version of Christianity. You don't say a prayer and you're saved, and you don't have to worry about it. Yes, that's how we enter into the relationship with Jesus Christ, but it's a relationship. This guy didn't grow calluses on his knees and grooves in the floor of his house because he was, well, he'd said a prayer, and therefore he was there. It's a continual relationship that has to be nurtured and developed, as any relationship does.
Had to be fruit.
Yeah, there has to be fruit as well. In this book, there are 50 imperative statements in 108 verses. In other words, almost every other verse is a don't or do. It's an imperative statement. That's why we highlight so much. This letter is also written to encourage the down and out and to convict the rich and the powerful. This book is not about celebrate your riches. It's about don't you dare give the best seat in the house to the rich person and make the poor person sit on the floor. Don't you dare. Don't you realize that the rich people in this day were certainly that way. Didn't get rich from hard work. They got it from your backs. Some powerful stuff there. So when was the letter written? That's another big question. We know that James was martyred in AD 62. Anybody remember when Paul was martyred? Peter and Paul?
67.
Between 64 and 67. We don't know exactly, but somewhere in that range. In the war with Rome, which took place between 66 and 70, the rich Jews suffered major losses, which would have lessened the gap between the poor and the rich addressed by James. In other words, after the Roman War, the war between the Romans and the Jews, all Jews lost everything. So if this letter is written to the 12 tribes, after the Roman War, there's no rich Jew. There's no such thing because the Romans took it all. So the letter would have been written prior to that because there's no rich Jews left as of 66. The development of the church seems very limited, as James just mentions elders. Now, in what we just read in Timothy and in Titus, he mentions elders and he mentions deacons. The church has developed a lot more by the time that Paul writes those letters than what is mentioned in this letter. He only mentions the role of elders. Christians were still fervently expecting the return of Christ. which was more true of the first generation Christians. The first generation Christians believed that Christ was going to return within their lifetime. The second, third generation realized, maybe not. We need to be ready, but we don't know. Kind of the same way that we are. We think it's very possible, we hope so, but maybe not. Whereas the first generation Christians were very adamant. That's why in Thessalonians they were quitting their job, because they thought, hey, if this is coming, I'm not working anymore. So the Christians were fervently, which was more likely for first generation Christians, which leads us to think that maybe this letter, or the letter was likely written between 40 and 62, but probably towards the front end of that. Now, when was Jesus crucified?
0.
080.
He was born 0.
33.
33 AD. So, it's very possible that this letter could have been written as early as 7 to 10 years after Jesus' resurrection. Now, what was the earliest letter of Paul?
We don't have a head like yours.
Galatians was probably Paul's first letter, which was written in Acts, probably right before Acts chapter 15, before he heads up to Jerusalem for the council. So that letter was Paul's earliest, and what is Paul focused on in that letter? Salvation by faith. It is not by works. So if these two are going at not the true application of the other, but the misapplication of the other, then it would make sense that these letters were written about the same time. Because they're wanting to make sure that we have a true picture of faith, not going either way. Not people who are saying all you have to do is say a prayer, and not people who are saying you have to earn your salvation. So if they're writing about the same time, trying to make sure that the full picture is out there, this is what a relationship with Jesus Christ looks like. Major themes in James. Man, this is hard, because there's just a bunch of stuff. But some of the major themes, wisdom comes from above. You think you're smart, you're not. Wisdom comes from above. All of our wisdom comes from God, not from ourselves. God allows tests and trials. Learn from them. The power of the tongue to destroy. And you pointed out this in verse 26 of chapter 1. If you claim to be religious but don't control your tongue, you're fooling yourself and your religion is worthless. Now that's quite the statement. Then he comes over in chapter 3 and really tears into it. Faith without works is dead.
Not going to show favoritism either, right?
That's right. Yeah, favoritism is another thing that he hits in this. Prayer is the proper response to trials, not self-seeking prayer, but true prayer. And then God does have the power to heal, is also another theme of this book. Theological truths that we draw from this letter. Laying on the hands and praying for one another comes from the book of James. We do that in the Nazarene Church. Understanding the necessity of works to show faith. We live what we say we believe, or we don't say we believe it. Basically what James is saying. Keeping prejudice from overrunning the church. The church is just like any other organization. It can very easily become corrupted by prejudice. Don't allow prejudice to overrun the church. And my favorite theological truth from James. Keep your mouth shut. When I was in high school, I had a t-shirt with the face of an ugly, wrinkled up old man on the front with his lip pulled up. And it said, "Shut your face." And then on the back, it had the verses from James chapter 3. When I was in high school, I liked that shirt. That's a very powerful concept, and one that we definitely need to keep in mind, because as he says here, we can control a whole lot of things. And I think we could write this a whole lot differently now. There he's talking about we can control animals and so forth. Think of all the things that we can do today with our technology, but yet we've not gotten any better at controlling our tongue, have we?
It's speaking without thinking.
Yeah. And no matter how many computer programs we have,
that's one thing we haven't gotten any better at. A tiny spark can set a great forest on fire, and the tongue is a flame of fire. It is a whole world of wickedness corrupting your entire body. It can set your whole life on fire, for it is set on fire by hell itself. How many of you have ever stuck your foot so far in your mouth that you understand that forest fire illustration?